on which we're all gathered, this land of ochre and the coloured sands, as the late Ruby Hunter put it so beautifully in her song, Welcome to All People. Our guests are Pip Williams and Kate Mildenhall. Pip lives on Peramunk and Kaurna country. Kate Mildenhall and I live on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country. And I know that everyone here tonight joins us in paying respects to elders past and present of the world's oldest storytellers. My name is Angela Savage. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Public Libraries Victoria, also known as the greatest job in the world. Now, I'm not going to read Kate and Pip's bios because you're here because you know how awesome they are and how brilliant their books are. Instead, I thought I'd share two snippets that weren't on the event blurb. The first is that Pip's latest novel, The Bookbinder of Jericho, was not only the best-selling Australian novel in 2023, it was also the most borrowed Australian fiction in Victoria's public libraries last year, which is awesome. And the second is that Kate is releasing her first children's book in October. And given how much we all love puns in library land, I'm sure collection staff will rush out to buy it, as it's called To Stir with Love. Gorgeous. Please join me in virtually welcoming Pip and Kate. So both of you can put your microphones on and we are going to dive in. Unmute yourselves.
Thank you, Ange.
It's so lovely to have you both here. And special thanks to Pip, because this was your idea.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, Warm Winter Reads. It was such an honour, and it was just fantastic to be able to share some of the books that I have adored, and Kate's was right up the top of the list. So this is really lovely.
So thank you both for being here tonight. I'm glad you mentioned the Warm Winter Read, Pip, because I was actually going to start with that. Given that this event is part of our Warm Winter Read campaign, I wanted to start by asking you about reading and whether you read as a child and how the two of you read now as writers. So Pip, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Well, I've always read, but actually I have had a love-hate relationship with reading. Some of people will already know, but I'm dyslexic, and so that has always created some challenges with reading. But mostly just because reading is slow, but really I'm not sure that that's a bad thing now. So reading was slow when I was a child, and it still is. And it's frustrating sometimes that I can't read as much as I would like. But on the other hand, I read carefully and I read every single word. So that's not a bad thing. But yeah, reading is half of my life.
Given that it is harder on account of the dyslexia, do you have less tolerance for a book that doesn't draw you in when you start reading it?
Yeah, less tolerance isn't quite the right word, because I'm not sure who I'm most intolerant with, the book or myself. So sometimes if I'm not getting into a book, I don't necessarily think it's because it's a bad book. I do sometimes think it's because I'm not sure how I should be reading it. And I wish I had perhaps sometimes a broader bandwidth when it comes to some books.
I just find it extraordinary. I find your bio extraordinary from that point of view because, you've been an academic, you've written memoir, you've written these two extraordinary novels, and you're clearly a great reader because, you've recommended wonderful books for our campaign. And I kind of almost want to draw a parallel between you and your character, Peggy, in The Bookbinder of Jericho, as these. I know you've talked about it not being autobiographical, but I feel like there's something of Peggy in you, in that young woman who wants something that appears to be denied to her.
Yeah, I actually, Angela, I think that you're probably right. I think Peggy, there was a lot about Peggy's desire to go to university and to have access, I suppose, to something that maybe wasn't naturally given to her. So, I didn't have role models for people who'd gone to university in my family necessarily. My father and I graduated actually in the same year.
Wow.
So he went to university at the same time I did. and it's something that I aspired to. So I suppose in that sense, we are similar. Yeah.
I know we're jumping ahead of ourselves, and I do want to get into more detail about the Bookbinder of Jericho. But Kate, tell me about you. As I'm picturing you as one of those kids with a torch under the doona, reading late into the...
Yeah, that was absolutely me, Angela. And I have spent some of today at my local library, which is the Eltham Library, and getting some writing done. But I was reminded while I was there of just how much time I spent in the library because I couldn't get enough books. I read really fast, which is sometimes problematic. I don't catch every word because I read so fast. And that 10 books that you used to be allowed to have wasn't enough. I'm so glad that they have upped the limit because I needed so many. And you can see, this is one of my bookshelves behind me. Over the side, I've got the books that I'm currently reading. Then there's the books that I have to read and the books I want to read. And I just have a constant list coming in of the books that I put on hold at the library as well, which I feel is good because then I've got a little bit of time pressure on me that way. But yeah, and I read, mum and dad were English teachers and history teachers. So there were a lot of books in our house, which I'm extremely grateful for. And I read between, I can remember dad reading Lord of the Rings to us, and The Hobbit, and then I read his copies of Duncton Wood, and I was obsessed with Anne of Green Gables, and so many books. I can't imagine my life without reading. It would make me incredibly sad.
Somehow none of this surprises me, Kate, but you did. It's actually a great segue when you mentioned some of those significant books. I wanted to ask both of you, perhaps Kate first, if you can name a book that you consider formative or influential in terms of your own writing, whether it was something that inspired you to become a writer or something that you wanted to emulate or something that you thought, damn, if that can be published, I can do better than that.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely didn't think that. The one, and I, I'm sorry for anyone who's heard this story before, because the one I always have to say is Cloud Street, is Winton's Cloud Street. I read it when I was in maybe year 10. I think it had only just come out. Mum and dad were obsessed with it. I then studied it for literature, and just those first couple of pages, I mean, I think the rhythm of those and the language, Winton's language there, the fact that he seemed to undo so many rules that I thought were rules that one had to follow, was so exciting for me, like so incredibly exciting. And I think that book has been a touchstone all of my writing life that I've tried to emulate. And it was just the most glorious thing in the past couple of years to get to interview Winton for the podcast, and then to have him, Angela, ring me up to tell me that he'd read Hummingbird and to say how much he loved it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was. There is no other moment really in terms of whatever the Miles Franklin, Winton rang me.
That is awesome. And it almost feels like a kind of a narrative arc in itself, that story. Yeah. It's beautiful. Pip, what about you? That's a hard story to top, I recognise. But was there a particular book that you read that made you think, yes, I want to be able to write like this, or I want to be a writer like that person, or damn, I can do better than that?
Well, my story isn't quite so lofty. I remember when I was about 10 or 11, which is when Puberty Blues came out. So Kathy Lett and Gabrielle Carey. I wrote my version of Puberty Blues. I wrote the first chapter of my version of Puberty Blues over and over again, slightly different iterations. I have never really had that feeling of reading something and thinking I want to write like that author. I've had the feeling of reading something and thinking I want to write a story that excites me or moves me as much as that story does, which is maybe something slightly different. And so that's what I say, Puberty Blues was the story of my, tweens, and that's why it mattered so much. But that is the first book that I'd read where I thought, I can do this, and it's probably because I thought, oh, I have a similar story to this, because I grew up on Manly Beach. So, I sort of understood that story and thought, oh, I could try this. That was probably the beginning. And since then, I think I just subliminally cherry pick from so many different writers that I admire.
So it's a nice segue to my next question, which, so I get the sense from what you were saying that there was a feeling of a story worth telling. So there's a resonance there. This is my story. This story's in a book. This is a story worth telling. I have a story worth telling, which I think is, that in Library Land we talk so much about books as windows and mirrors, and how important it is for people to see their own lives reflected in what they read. Now that said, and you did write academic work. You wrote a memoir about your family's time in Italy, and then you turned to fiction. And I understand you were working on quite a different novel before you started working on the Dictionary of Lost Words. What was the inspiration for the dictionary, and why was it irresistible? Because I think you were 20,000 words in, right? Which is a lot to abandon.
Yeah, and actually I still really like that story idea. So it really was an idea that wouldn't let me go. And I like you said, I was 20,000 words into a book I was quite enjoying, although I have to say I had never written fiction, so I can't say that I was confidently writing that book. But it was the book I was going to kind of, I was going to launch myself on. But then I read Simon Winchester's Surgeon of Crowthorne, which is a non-fiction book about the making of the Oxford English Dictionary. And by the time I'd got to the end of that book, which I really enjoyed, the only question I had in my head was, is it possible that some words are missing from the dictionary, because all of the words that are in it had to have been written down by someone. And at the time the dictionary was compiled, most of the words had been written down by men, and they were being defined by men. And as a social scientist, as a research scientist, I did it was a research question. I just thought the data is flawed. If this was a research paper and it had been sent into a journal, they'd reject it, because the data was flawed. The data was biased towards a particular group and didn't represent all of the people it was pretending to represent. That's how my brain was working. Yep. And it wasn't for quite some time, a year or so, when I was writing this other book, that I had an opportunity to go to the UK and to an Arvon. I don't know if anyone's heard of Arvon. It's this wonderful, writing workshop that you can do for a week in the UK. And I had this opportunity, and I just realized I had to take this new idea, this idea about the dictionary, to that workshop. And I literally had 2 pages of writing that I took with me, but it's the story that just wanted to be written at that time. So I put the other one aside.
Did you have the start of Esme at that point, or was even before that?
No, Esme was, she came first, actually. This image of a little girl under the sorting table, which I'd read about in Simon Winchester's work. This image of this little girl looking at the men's shoes, all of the lexicographers who are doing the work, and she's this 4 or 5-year-old, and she's hidden, so she's seen and not heard. And she's just looking at the shoes of all of these men and making assessments of their character based on their shoes and how they're holding their feet or tapping them, or, all that sort of thing. And that was the first scene I wrote. And the second scene I wrote was actually the epilogue, was the last 2 pages. And that's what I went to the UK with. And once I started, I couldn't
All you
stop.
had to do was fill in the middle.
yeah. but actually for me, it was one of the bravest things I've ever done, because I wasn't a novelist. I'd never written fiction, and I honestly thought that this story, well, I actually thought the idea was such a good one. I really thought it was a good idea, and that I probably wasn't the person to execute it because I didn't have the experience, and that I might ruin it. Yeah, so I did it in secret, but at least I did it.
And thankful we are that you did
Yeah.
do it, because my God, what a beautiful job you did of it. It's still one of my favourite books of that year. It's just stunning. And rereading your work, I think both of your works, I think I've enjoyed. I know I've enjoyed even more. It's just gorgeous. And I want to get back to Bookbinder as well, but I'm going to ask Kate, because I know you've got a great backstory too to the inspiration for your first novel, Skylarking, and I wondered if you could share that with us.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, similarly to Pip, in the fact that I'd written short stories. I'd gone back to study writing, when I came across the idea for Skylarking, and I was at RMIT and I was doing one of those writing workshop classes where you had to bring some material each week. And so after we were on holidays, it was the winter break, and we'd gone camping with my family, 2 little kids, and our best mates near Shoalhaven, near Nowra, and at the Green Patch camping ground. And our tent was next to the grave of this young woman who had died in 1887 from being accidentally shot. It said on the little kind of monument there on the grave. And I guess I've always been a person, like when we traveled, I'm just that person who looks at all of the historical notes and wants to know the story behind things. But it had never occurred to me to write a historical novel. But I was intrigued by this grave and by the true story of what had happened there, and the fact that this girl had apparently been accidentally killed by her best friend, and that they were the daughters of the lighthouse keepers. And so it went from there. I went immediately to Trove to see if I could find out any information about it. And also, kind of like that way, Pip, you were talking about kind of this idea and would you break it? Like I was like, has anyone else written this story already? Like, surely someone's written about this already. And when I worked out they hadn't, and I also found the most extraordinary historical documents on Trove, like the newspaper articles that included the inquest from 1887 in the Shoalhaven Times. So I had these kind of voices and these characters ready-made. And so I just started writing what I thought would be a short story about how on earth one could accidentally kill their best friend. And I took it to my class. And in that way where, you share it around and you're kind of nervously waiting for everyone to say that's terrible, or I didn't like this sentence, or I didn't like that sentence, everyone said, oh, what happens next? And so it was this momentum from people, like what I guess as a storyteller as a kid that I had received when people were like, oh yeah, keep telling us the story, keep telling us the story. That was how it got written. And it was only when I had, 10,000 or so words that I was like, well, this isn't a short story. Like, this could actually be a novel. But like people often say, your first novel is a gift in a way, because you don't realize that's what you're writing so often. And you don't realize how damn hard it's going to be, which is what happens the subsequent times.
Yes, I think if I could count up the number of first debut novelists who thought they were writing a short story at the time, it's quite significant. So the 2 books that feature on our Warm Winter Read bookmark. So Pip, we've been showcasing the Bookbinder of Jericho as your latest, and your recommendation was Kate's work, The Hummingbird Effect. So I want to ask you about those 2 books. And Kate, I might start with you about The Hummingbird Effect. It's a hard one to give a 25-word pitch about, isn't it?
It really is. Would you like me to?
I'd like you to have a go.
So The Hummingbird Effect is a book about women and work, is how I generally describe it. But it's set over 250 years, and it tells the story of 4 different women in 4 different timelines. And really, the questions I'm asking are about the nature of technological change in factories in 1933, the societal change in 2020 during COVID in an aged care home, industry, but tech, women's bodies in 2031, and a kind of an IVF storyline, and then the kind of total collapse of the world in 2181. And there's also an algorithm in there. That was not a good and definitive description of what the book is, but like you said, Angela, there is no way to describe what I wrote.
It's extraordinary. But it's not what you started writing, is it?
It is not.
What did you start with?
I started writing historical fiction straight up. Set in 1933, I became obsessed with the Angus Meatworks. So for any of you joining us tonight who are from Footscray or from the West, I got family over there. I heard a story one night about the Angus Meatworks burning down, and I became obsessed with that. And as a writer who only gets one idea at a time, I jumped on it as the idea for my next book. And then the historical archive around Footscray, around the meatworks, there were transcripts of interviews with meat workers. There was so much for me to draw on that I wrote a whole novel about the year 1933 and the women who worked in the Angus Meatworks. And it revolved around a union strike that happened in 33 where they tried to stop the chain system of slaughtering coming into the meatworks and into Australia. And I wrote that book and I quite enjoyed that book, and I handed it to my publisher. And in that period of time where your publisher goes, I don't know if it's really working, you need to make some changes, I exploded the thing and I turned it into the book that it is now.
Now, I also remember you saying that you drew on inspiration from Anthony Doerr's novel Cloud Cuckoo Land when you exploded it.
Yes.
Which is another magnificent novel. And I kind of love the relationship between those 2 books. And I'm just a bit gratuitously mentioning it because if there are library staff here tonight at tonight's event who have not read this book, you totally need to read both Kate's book, The Hummingbird Effect, and Anthony Doerr's Cloud Cuckoo Land, because he dedicates it, I quote, to the librarians then, now, and in years to come. Yeah, it's a paean to libraries. It's extraordinary. But I'm digressing. I'm sorry.
No, do not digress. It makes up a lot of my PhD, that book. And the other books that I based it on too, it's not about librarians, but Greenwood by Michael Christie, which is another book that people will find in all the glorious libraries there, is another extraordinary book. It's about trees and the nature of forests. And that was another book I drew heavily on in terms of a book that is kind of multi-timeline and fragmented, but that the stories hopefully combine in a satisfying way for the reader.
Thank you for that. I'm glad you mentioned a book recommendation, because I meant to alert our audience to the fact that we're not going to do Q&A tonight because there's just too many of you, and it's too stressful trying to manage Q&A. But we would like to invite you all to share a favourite historical or speculative fiction novel. We're going to, you can email those recommendations to admin@plv.org.au, and we will share the list with all of you who've registered for tonight's event, and with Kate and Pip. But yes, I'll repeat that email later in the event as well. But Pip, I want to go back to you and the inspiration behind the Bookbinder of Jericho, because again, I understand that you came up with that idea while you were still putting the finishing touches on the dictionary. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And just before we move on, I just want to second those books. I didn't know, Kate, that, those 2 books that you just mentioned, Cloud Cuckoo Land and Greenwood, I mean, obviously your book speaks to those books so well, but they're 2 of my favorite books, which I think is why I love your book so much. So
yes,
it's really lovely. Yeah, I so enjoyed this. So
Mm.
yeah, I highly recommend them too. Yeah, so I came up with the idea for Bookbinder while I was in the archives of Oxford University Press doing the last bit of research for Dictionary of Lost Words. So that book had been written, and this is the way I seem to write. I get a full complete draft, but I leave a million gaps. And the gaps are all about the research that I can't actually do in Australia. It's research that I have to actually go to the place where the book is written in order to fill in all sorts of gaps. So it could be gaps about place, what the streets are like, what the roads are made of, what birds are twittering in the hedgerows along the canal, what the weather might be like at a particular time of year. Or it could be research that I can only really get from archives that aren't digitized. And so I was in the archives of Oxford University Press, and I'd asked the archivist for everything he had about the women who worked in the bindery, because I was writing a scene in Dictionary about a book that was being bound in secret. And so the women in the bindery were helping one of my characters to bind this book. So I just wanted to know who they were, what they would do, all that sort of stuff. The archivist brought me 2 photographs, black and white photographs of women folding the pages that have come off the printing press from the early 1920s, so fairly contemporary to the time I was interested in, and a farewell card to the controller of the press, or the head printer, Horace Hart, and also a black and white film that had been made in the early 20s about the making of a book. And that's it. That's all they had about up to 80 women who worked in the bindery at the press. But they had boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of materials about the men and the work that they did. And I watched the film, and in the film, 90% of it is about the work that the men do, but there was a section of the women folding, but a beautiful section of a woman gathering the sections of a book onto her hand. I'm doing it very slowly. She did it so fast. And she also did it with grace and beauty. It's like she's dancing along this very long bench, gathering a book into her arms. And I immediately wondered, what is the book that she's reading? And I stopped the film and I peered in, but I couldn't figure it out. And then I asked myself, I wonder if she ever stops to read what she's working on. And immediately I knew that if she did stop to read, that speed I was talking about would slow her down. And she's part of a production line. She's a cog in a wheel. She would be reprimanded by her supervisor if she stopped to read. And immediately I had a character, someone who wanted to read the books, not bind them. And I wrote that line down because I knew I couldn't write that story because I still hadn't finished the other one. But once, I don't know if you're like this, Kate, once you've got an idea, you don't actually have to do anything with it. It will grow. It's like you put a seed in soil, and if you're lucky, you can just walk away and leave it. And a little while later, you'll see something sprouting out of the ground. And in a way, that's what, this sentence did. I didn't have to pay attention to it in any way, but it has a snowball effect, an idea, and little other ideas attach itself to it. And when I had the time to sit down and think about it, I already had a whole lot of ideas hanging off that one sentence, which I could start writing a new book.
It's amazing and beautiful. And actually, I had heard you speak about that film. I think it was actually in an interview with Kate on the First Time podcast, and I went and had a look at it ahead of tonight. And it's, yes, that scene, that woman is just, I can totally understand why you were so struck by her. She's begging to have her story written, really. And more power to you for saying that, Pip. It's just it's beautiful. And look, yes, I think I think one of the things that I love so much about both your work is the strong female characters in the stories that are totally credible for their time, but they're also really interesting. And so in both the Dictionary of Lost Words and in Bookbinder of Jericho, you've got these really rich characters, these women who are, how would you describe them? They're like nonconformists, but they're not, they're not unbelievable. And I guess my question is, how do you create those characters when you're writing historical fiction and you have to avoid imposing a modern mindset or incongruous kind of mindset? How do you balance that with your female characters?
I really love this question, and I suspect that Kate can speak to it as well. I think this idea that people in the past don't think the way we think now is completely wrong. I think that the reason we have all of as women, the reason that we can vote in this country, and that we're still not there, obviously, but we're getting closer and closer to, being able to have political and social contributions that our male counterparts have. The reason we have that is because there were women who thought like us 100 years ago and 200 years ago and 1,000 years ago. Women have always wanted more than they have been given, I think is a truth. They haven't always had the means and the structural apparatus around them to achieve that, but they've always wanted it. And in writing the characters that I wrote, I wanted to write ordinary women, and I think all ordinary people are extraordinary in their own way, and I was tapping into the extraordinary of these ordinary women. Esme in the Dictionary of Lost Words has probably had a slightly eccentric upbringing in that she was brought up by a father and without a mother in the home. But Peggy, I think, is a pretty typical working class woman who's highly intelligent and frustrated by that production line work that she's inherited from her own mother and from the community that she lives in, and simply because of her class and gender. And I think women like her have existed throughout history, and you don't have to look far to find them in any time in history. I've been listening, it will be a book recommendation later, but I've been reading Papyrus, which is all about books, right back to the Egyptian times and the library in Alexandria.
Don't talk about Alexandria. A lot of us still mourn it.
Yes, yeah, that's right. But the thing is, throughout this story, throughout history, for thousands of years, go back 4,000 years, there's still women that we know about because of their striving to exist in the world of men, or to read, or to be educated, or to be teachers. They exist throughout history. There's not many of them, because their lives were never valued as much as the men at those times, but they have always existed. And if one existed, I suspect there were many, many, many others that we just don't know about.
Kate, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Pip said, and I think that idea too of the extraordinary and the ordinary, part of what I wanted to do in Hummingbird was to show kinship between women, and the Hummingbird Project, the Hummingbird Effect, is dedicated to my grandmother, who grew up in a household of women when her father was killed when she was only 18 months old. So she grew up with her sisters and her mother, and then her aunt moved in. And it was always a story that kind of fascinated me, how they formed a family. And so Hummingbird is in many ways about the way that women care for each other and look after each other, and the kind of the way that the small acts of caring. So Peggy and Lil are two of the characters in 1933. Lil's an older woman, and Peggy has moved into her house, and Lil has to protect Peggy in a way from a violent relationship, and the way that she holds the door, and doesn't let him in. I think again, women have been doing that for all time and continue to do it. And it's those acts of sisterhood, of friendship, the way that nurses cared for each other, the way that in 2020, the aged care workers who were so under the pump, having to look after people during COVID with such limited resources, the way that they cared for the elderly people in their care. Those were the kinds of stories that I wanted to highlight about the way that the kind of work that women does, the labor that women do, whether it is paid or unpaid, and how powerful that is.
And I think what's extraordinary about both your books is that, and I think what you're saying is really powerful, because that notion that we have what we have today in terms of our rights is because of the women who fought for it beforehand. But it's one thing to write about cultural outliers, of which there is in all cultures in all times, but it's another to find the extraordinary in the ordinary, which both of you do in these books. And I think that's a real part of the power of these books. This is what makes it, as a reader, you feel like you have such access to these women's lives, because there are echoes, I guess, of our own lives in theirs. And I want to pick up actually on that point about echoes, by Kate mentioning, so the fact that your first novel, Skylarking, was historical fiction, your second one, The Mother Fault, was speculative fiction.
Yeah.
The Hummingbird Effect is both and more, which includes that narrative strand you alluded to, set in 2020, which, although that's contemporary for us, it actually feels historical reading it now.
Right.
And I found it incredibly moving, that particular strand. And I'm just interested in whether there are similarities between writing historical and speculative fiction, or whether you have to switch your mindset completely to write in those different genres.
I love that question, Ange, and partly because I've been sitting today at the library, as I said, working away, and I'm currently writing contemporary fiction, and I find that the hardest of everything. Because with historical, you often have this kind of with Skylarking, I had the skeleton of a true story, or you have the research. I had the Union Strike in 1933. I could look at world events. I could read the newspapers. I could look at, the Women's Weekly came out for the first time in 1933, so I could look at those pages and see what people were wearing and what they were eating. So for me, historical fiction has that delicious aspect of the research. Speculative fiction is hard in a different way, because you have to build a whole entire world, and that's really hard, and you can do anything. And the first time I realized that The Mother Fault was speculative, I was like, oh no, like this is going to be so much work. I have to understand the politics and the social structure of this world, and what's happened, what the recent history is, what happened to make this world this way. So I find them both difficult in different ways, and enjoyable in different ways. But I think the thing that's been really interesting about writing speculative fiction, both in Hummingbird and in The Mother Fault, is this idea of the kind of radical hope that one can put into that, especially with what we know and many of the things that we're grappling with in our near future and further future, that to be able to treat the thought experiment of fiction as an act of hope has been something that I've embraced or I've enjoyed. And that's not to say, in lots of ways, neither book is very hopeful in some of the ways that it talks about what happens to the world. But I think what you can do in fiction is your characters can have hope, and they can have ways of navigating the world that they're in that give the reader questions and that feeling that I too.
Oh,
lost you briefly.
While she's getting it, there she is. Shall I pick up while she gets herself back on? and this is, talking about Kate's book, it's really extraordinary, which is why I chose it, and why I've loved it so much, because of these, 4 timelines, but it's also four completely different styles of writing, as well as 4 different worlds. And I know that a lot of people have described your book, Kate. Sorry, we lost you for a minute, Kate. So
Oh,
I just
sorry.
That's all right. But one of the things that, I know people have said, it's ambitious and it's mad and it's incredible. But the thing is, you pull it off. Like it's such an ambitious thing that Kate has tried to do, and she's succeeded 100% in linking these 4 timelines plus 2 beautiful ribbons tie these things together, like an AI project and a river. And they're through all of the stories, and the stories are linked in other ways too, which is just so deliciously satisfying when you get to the end. But the other thing that you haven't mentioned is how different the style of writing is in each of these time periods. And it's a style of writing that fits the experiences of the characters, but also the place in time perfectly. And it makes sense. And as a reader, it was so exciting and to read, and so incredibly satisfying. Yeah. So Kate, you might have more to say, but I was just
I totally
Carry on.
echo that. I totally echo that, Pip. And actually, it's interesting in that question I asked about historical fiction and speculative fiction. Again, you had some interesting things to say about this in an interview with Kate. And I don't know if you remember, and I'm putting you on the spot by asking you to remember, but you said they actually have a lot in common when they're good. And it was, can you remember what you talked about? How historical fiction and spec fiction are.
I'm not sure what I said then, but what I'd say now. So if it's different, let's just not tell anybody. But I think speculative fiction and historical fiction are both. But what they both do is you have to put yourself in the place of someone who lives in a different time to where we're living, whether it's in the future or the past. I've alluded to this before, humanity stays the same. So we as humans, in effect, stay the same in that we have the same range of emotions, the same desires and fears, the same sort of complexities will challenge us. They just might look different and feel different at a different point in time, but we will respond in a similar way to aggression or to uncertainty or to oppression. And I think the trick in both historical and speculative fiction is to make sure that the truth that we're telling is the truth of being human, even if the context is strange and different. It's the truth of being human that brings the reader along. And that, I think, is, when they talk about write what you know, I totally disagree with that in so many ways. But I think where I agree with it is write what you know about being human. But then hopefully couch it in something that you're just curious about, rather than something, that write about what you're curious about, or you won't be able to sustain it for 3 years.
Yeah.
Yes, you want to be really curious. Kate, do you want to add to that?
About writing what you're curious about.
Well, and also about that notion that Pip was just talking about the human experience, speaking through, whether it's historical or speculative, whatever world you're writing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that recognizing the 16-year-old girl in Skylarking, which is what so many students do who read Skylarking in school, and when I go out and talk to them, and they're like, she's just like me. She feels just like me. And that's exactly right. That the language is different. The setting is different, the context is different, but the feeling of jealousy about one's friends, the feeling of not understanding what's happening in your own body, the feeling of dreaming of being away but at home at the same time at that stage in your life, they're the same. And so I think they are the things that make us as readers be able to read so vastly across different genres as well, and love both historical and speculative fiction, as well as all the other things as well, because of that, exactly that.
Again, sorry, Pip, go ahead.
I was just going to pick up on something else Kate said about hope, and especially Kate's book is a very hopeful book, despite all of the threat that some of the innovations that she writes about in some of the timelines. Despite the threat of that, it's a very hopeful book. And I think the same probably applies to historical fiction, even though we kind of know how it ends because we're ahead of the timeline. I think the historical fiction that I've written, but also the historical fiction that we tend to enjoy the most, is where we can see that moment of hope in our past that has led to something better happening for a group of people in their future, which is now our present. So in my books, I was interested in women's representation politically, but also in language in the first book. And in the second book, I was interested in women's access and working class access to education. We've seen changes. What happens to my characters is kind of hopeful at the end of that story, but we can relate to it because we've seen where that hope has led. And in Kate's work, we can only hope that hope that you talk about is sustained beyond.
Both of the books, again, I mentioned rereading them with such a deep pleasure, and there's a degree to which, perhaps because I knew the story, I could just more fully immerse myself in the characters. Although I have to admit, Pip, every time I read the Bookbinder of Jericho, I want a different outcome. And there's one point, I won't spoil it for people who haven't read it, but there's one point in the book I'm like, no, I want a different outcome. But
and then
again, you probably know it.
And then it's repeated in the next book.
But I think one of the many reasons I love the book so much, and there's the beautiful writing, and there's the characters who are the extraordinary ordinary, and there's the resonances with our present lives in your historical work and your speculative work. We see ourselves despite the difference in the context. But personally for me too, it's also the centering of women in narratives that traditionally haven't centered women. Dystopian fiction has traditionally been the kind of, the side of the lone man or the ranger, and stories of working class, the work has always been associated with men. So I think what both of you offer is something very beautiful and different and strong. And I'm just kind of interested in your reflections on that, and how you do that without it becoming didactic, I guess, is another question.
I get in trouble. I get a lot of questions saying, why don't you write more about nice men?
Sorry.
And I think, well, certainly for Hummingbird, I mean, this is, I think it will be an ongoing obsession for me in every book I write about the lives of women, and the work that they do. But I think sometimes that is a limit or a boundary that one gives themselves. As a writer, what I'm always wanting is to both have a question that makes me excited and interested enough for the period of time, but also to have some kind of experiment or boundary on myself that I can write within, and to know that I wanted to write a book that expressed the lives of women in lots of different ways across different times was one of those boundaries. And I think, as in many groups of people who have been underrepresented in the past in books, there is still an element of writing back, and that will continue for lots of different groups
Swing
as
that
well.
pendulum, baby. I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. Pip, how about you in terms of that centralising women's narratives? I mean, it's such a huge part of what you do.
Well, and actually, I think Kate and our books are similar again in this centering of women, but also centering women's work. And the other thing that they share is this, writing about, I suppose, women, communities of women who support each other, found family as well. It's something that is similar in both our novels, even though they're incredibly different, stories and styles and all of those things. Those fundamental, the spine of them is similar. In some ways, I don't think about it too much. And so I suppose what's happening is I'm writing about a story that I want to, I'm writing about something I want to know about. And I apologize to all the men in the audience. I'm not that interested. I've read enough. I've read enough about you. and so I have written about women that I'm interested in doing jobs, doing work. That's really important that my characters work, because I have always worked, and I always find it odd when I read books and women aren't doing anything. And we get so much from our work, and it also takes so much from us. So, I like to have my characters working. But I'm also not interested personally in writing bad men doing bad things to individual women. I'm really interested in how community and political structures keep women and men in their place and perpetuate these divisions and inequalities and oppressions. That's the thing I'm really interested in. And when I write about that, of course, there will be men implicated in that system, but it's not the individual men I care about particularly, it's the system. And I've really enjoyed exploring that without making it too obvious that's what I'm doing, simply by saying, well, how would a woman live in this system if she wanted an education? What would she have to do to fight the system, not to fight her neighbor or her, her father or whatever, but what would she have to do to fight the system to get what she wants? Because essentially that's what we're always doing, is fighting the system in the end.
Absolutely. Look, I'm conscious of time, and I knew this was going to happen, that as soon as the three of us got talking, we could go all night. I want to remind the people in the audience that we would love to have you share with us your favourite historical fiction or speculative fiction by emailing it to us at admin@plv.org.au. And we'd love to put that list together to share with you after today. But Pip, I'm going to finish up by getting you to talk about each other's work. So Pip, you as an ambassador, you've nominated Kate's book as one of your 4 recommended reads, and actually Kate's second novel, The Mother Fault, was recommended by Jane Harper in our inaugural, which puts you up there with Emma Viskich as the most recommended of our readers so far.
Yes.
So you have talked a little bit about this, but what is it that you love about Kate's work? Why did you put that book here?
Well, I love it. I'm going to quote my partner, actually. I asked, because he's read it as well, and I said, so tell me what you loved about it. And he said, it's gutsy and it works. And I totally agree. I think the best fiction takes a risk, and Kate, I think, I don't know if you think this, but I think Kate took a risk writing what she did, and I'm so grateful that she didn't didn't step back from the edge of that cliff, because it just soars, and it's really worth. I loved every section of it. That's the other thing. So many books that have multiple timelines, you can't wait to get back to one of the timelines. And that was not the case with this. They were all so perfectly balanced within themselves. They were so individual and differentiated, and yet they all had weight. And I just enjoyed the whole thing. And I loved how Kate incorporates AI throughout this book. It's funny. It's also thought-provoking. And in fact, all the sections were funny, thought-provoking, and poignant. It was, just in every way.
I agree.
As a writer, it's very
Blushing.
impressive because there's a different voice. In every section, there's a different voice. It's like she's written 5 books in one.
You go, girl.
Felt like that sometimes.
And Kate, so to finish up, because I often know it is easier to talk about each other's work than your own.
Totally.
You've interviewed Pip on your podcast a couple of times and in person on multiple occasions. It's really obvious to the listener when you talk about her how much you admire her work. So tell us what it is that you love about Pip's books.
You know, I just picked up Bookbinder this afternoon and just kind of dipped into it again. And I'll say the same thing that I said when I first read it, which is it's like coming home. And I think that's why so many readers adore both of the works as well, because the way that Pip writes both place and character, aside from all of the extraordinary kind of meanings and politics and the rest of it, the way that the character and the place just live on the page, in the boat, on the river. I think, and the thing that strikes me again and again, and this was something I thought about. I remember thinking about it when I was writing 1933 in The Workers, that attention to and honouring of women's work as well. I just think, and hearing you speak about it, Pip, is an extra special pleasure because you do it so beautifully in the books, but then it's like we get this whole additional kind of bulb around it of all the other things you've been thinking about it. But character and place, those characters feel like friends.
Thank you, Kate. This is so difficult, just, for everyone watching. Listening.
Look, I think we need to get, as a community of readers and writers, we know the power of the word of mouth. And, I think we in Libraryland are passionately dedicated to matching great books to readers. So this kind of activity has just been, a wonderful opportunity for us. I know, looking at the participant list, we've got a lot of people who are working in libraries among the audience today, but also members of the public. It's been an incredible opportunity to speak with you both. We've been talking about all your collected works, all of which I cannot recommend highly enough to people. As we've said, you can borrow them from the library or purchase them at your favourite bookshop. But I particularly want to thank Pip and Kate for being here tonight, for that beautiful conversation, for your generosity, for your ideas. It's you inspire as readers, as writers, as women. Thank you so much for being here. Please, everyone, join me in a virtual round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Ange. And thank you, Pip. And thank you, all you lovely people we can't see. But thank you for your hands that we can see.
Thank you, everyone.